How to install Jenkins on Amazon Linux 2023. Here's today's starting point. I have a fresh installation of Amazon Linux 2023. Down in the description of this video is a link to a gist that has all of the commands that we're going to be running. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to install a version of Java on this instance. So what I want to do is I want to install the Temurin version of the JDK. So if we go over to the documentation for Temurin, we'll see installation instructions for CentOS, RHEL, and Fedora. Now we know that Amazon Linux is based on Fedora, so we'll just use these commands. You notice really there's only two steps here. We need to first create an RPM repo, and then we need to just run dnf install. So I'm going to copy directly from here, go back over to our shell, and let's go ahead and just paste this in. We can see that we're just catting out the values here, and then it's going to write the file into adoptium.repo. Now currently I'm logged in as root, so I shouldn't have any permissions problems with this. So at this point, we should be ready to go. So if I type dnf install Temurin-17-JDK, we'll see what happens. We can see here that we're getting a 404 when we reference packages adoptium.net artifactory rpm amzn/2023.0. some other numbers, and then on down to repomd. What this means is when we expanded the variables that were here, specifically the distribution name, which was pulled from OS release, and then also echoing out the ID. If we were to take a look at cat etc os-release, what we'll see here is the ID is actually amzn. Now, if we go over to the adoptium rpm repo definition, what we'll see here is there is no definition for amzn. However, there is a reference for Amazon Linux and also a 2. Now, at the time of recording, since there isn't an AMZN with the long ID value, so what I'm going to do is instead of going ahead and just using the values that are here for distribution name and release ver, I'm going to go ahead and set these values explicitly to Amazon Linux 2. So I'm going to copy this. Let's go ahead and modify our etc yum reposd adoptium. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead and remove this and that. And let's go ahead and insert the hard-coded value for Amazon Linux /2. We'll go ahead and save this, clear this out, and let's run our dnf install one more time. And now we see that we have a version of Java that we can install. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, now the install is finished. Let's go ahead and verify that it was installed correctly. So we say java-version and we receive back 17.0.6, which is what we expected to come back from Temurin at this point in time. Now we're ready to go ahead and start installing Jenkins. So if we go to the Jenkins download page, we're going to install the stable version. And currently that version is 2.387.1. Let's go ahead and click, much like what we saw for installing the JDK, we want to go ahead and install for CentOS, RHEL, Fedora. We'll click on the same link that's here under the LTS side of the instructions. And basically we have three steps here that we want to run. We have a wget line, we have an RPM import, and then we don't need to install the JDK because we've already installed the JDK, and then we'll install Jenkins. So three steps, wget, RPM, and install. So I'm going to copy wget. Let's paste this in. Let's go ahead and grab our RPM import for the key. And then finally, we're going to do a dnf install Jenkins. So dnf install Jenkins. And we will say yes. So first up, let's verify that Jenkins was actually installed and see if it's running or not. So let's first check ps aux ww, and let's grep for Java. Right now, we don't see any Java processes running, so that means that Jenkins is not running. So let's go ahead and start up Jenkins. So we'll say systemctl start Jenkins. Now that that's completed, let's run the same ps command that we saw before. And now we can see a line here where we have a Java, a -d for headless true, -jar referencing the Jenkins war file, and then also an attribute for webroot and one for HTTP port. Now remember that line. Let's go ahead and run another command, systemctl --full status Jenkins. And what we can see here under the C group line, we see this exact same line that we just saw. We see Java, headless true, jar file, our war reference, a webroot reference, and our HTTP port reference. We also notice here that we have a loaded and an active. So everything looks to be running. Let's go into our browser and let's see if it's actually running. So I'll paste in the IP address and check the port, and we can see that we are at the unlock screen for Jenkins. But instead of setting up Jenkins right now, what I want to do is I want to make some changes to the startup parameters. So let's go back over to our shell. Let's quit out of status, and let's go ahead and stop the Jenkins process. And now let's go ahead and type systemctl edit Jenkins. And what this file is telling us is that any changes we make to it between this top comment and this bottom comment are going to be the changes that are applied to the file that is called override conf. So let me go ahead and paste in the changes that I want to make. What we can see here is I am adding 2 environment items to the service block. The first environment item is for Java Ops, and the second one is for Jenkins Ops. Now, if we take a look for Java Ops within this file, what we'll see is obviously the first one that we just pasted in, but if we look below, we'll see that there was already one here that had headless true. Well, if we go back to our version, we've also brought in the headless true. I've added in another one for prefer IPv4 stack. I'm setting the temp dir, then I'm also setting 2 entries for time zones, both for America and New York. Now, secondly, I'm setting a Jenkins Ops that is setting the value for plugin root. Now, if we take a look for Jenkins Ops, we'll see here that the default value for Jenkins Ops is actually empty. So we're just adding in a brand new one. So let's go ahead and save this file, and you'll notice right here at the top, we are editing etc systemd system Jenkins service d override.conf. Remember that name. Let's go ahead and save this. And before we start the service back up, let's take a look at our status. Now, we haven't started it yet, so we would expect it to not be running, but notice the changes that we see here. We see our loaded and we see our active, much like we saw when the process was running. But now we have the drop-in, which is our override.conf. That's the file that we just created. Now, since we specified a directory within that startup parameter for temp dir, that's not something that Jenkins can create for us. We need to manually create that directory and set the proper permissions. So let's go ahead and quit out of this, and we'll create our directory. And then we need to set the ownership to match what is in var cache Jenkins, because currently we're root. And if we didn't set the permissions, when a file tried to write to that temp dir, it would fail. So I'm going to say chown-r Jenkins:/Jenkins var cache Jenkins, because the Jenkins user was created when the RPM was installed. So that's the user that we want to use. Before we start the process again, I want to show you a couple more things. Systemctl show Jenkins. These have all of the commands that systemd is going to use to control the Jenkins process. If we search for environment, we're going to see Jenkins home here at the beginning. We're going to see Jenkins web root. And if we go right, we'll see the Java Ops. Now notice it starts out with headless true, but if we keep going right, we'll see our prefer IPv4 stack. We're going to see our temp dir declaration. We're going to see our 2 values for time zones. We see Jenkins port, which was a default. And now for Jenkins Ops, we see our plugin root that we specified. So now at this point, we're ready to go ahead and start up our Jenkins process. So again, we'll say systemctl start Jenkins. Let's go ahead and verify our status. So we'll say systemctl-full status Jenkins. We can see our loaded, our active, and also our drop-in with our override. If we were to take a look under the C group line now, as we scroll right, we see Java headless true. We see our IPv4 stack. We see temp dir. We see our references for time zone for both Jelly and for just the user. We see our war. We see web root, HTTP port, and finally, plugin root. So all of the changes that we made that ended up in the override conf are now applied to the process as it starts up. Now at this point, we're ready to go ahead and set up our Jenkins controller. So I'm going to scroll back left here. You'll notice here that the log is being emitted out into the status, or at least a small part of it. We need to use this password that's here in order to go ahead and set up our controller. Now we're going to go back to an old page. I'm going to refresh this page. That way I know that I've got the correct connection to this controller that's running. I'm going to paste in the password that I just copied, click on continue, and then we're going to install suggested plugins. Now that the plugins are installed, let's go ahead and create our user and add an email. We'll verify that the URL is correct. In our case, this is. Click Save and Finish. and then finally click on Start Using Jenkins. We can see here at the bottom right-hand corner that we have Jenkins 2.387.1, which is the version that we were expecting. Now, before I start using Jenkins, even though it told me I can go ahead and start using it, the first thing I like to do is I like to go ahead and just do a restart. That way I know later on, when everything was very first installed, I was able to do a restart. So I'll go ahead and click on Yes, and wait for the restart to complete. Now that it's back, let's go ahead and log in. And now at this point, we can attach our agents and start creating our jobs. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to us on Twitter at CloudBees. If this video was helpful to you, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to CloudBees TV yet, why not? Take a moment, click on that subscribe button, and then ring that bell, and you'll be notified anytime there's new content available on CloudBees TV. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.